Ambassador Henok Teferra Shawl, you represent Ethiopia here in Paris to France, and you have just taken over. You arrived in March, so welcome first of all to France, and welcome to our studios here at RFI. Now, you are someone who combined a background in business with solid experience in the civil service as well, both involving serious responsibilities. Now, there's an extra dimension. It's your long-established links with France. Now, you have indeed a long connection with France. Please actually correct me if I'm wrong with the details. It started with the French lycée in Berlin, the Französisches Gymnasium in Berlin, which was followed by the University of Nice Sophia Antipolis, where you gain a bachelor's degree in public and private international law. Then it was the University of Panthéon-Sorbonne, or Paris 1 as it's known, where you completed a master's degree in international economic law, and that was in 1998. Besides, your first work experience was in France as a teacher, first in Créteil and then as a software developer in Levallois-Perret. Both are in the Paris region. Now, could you tell us what actually brought about this French connection, how it happened in the first place, and what have you retained from those experiences?
Thank you very much for having me here, Mr. Singleton. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be in your studios. RFI is an institution in France, and also in Africa, in particular in Africa, where it has quite a lot of people who tune into it for information, and so it's a real pleasure to be here. Yes, you gave my background a little bit there in a summary, and generally it's correct. I would just maybe add one very important point. I started my studies at the lycée, at the French lycée Gebre Mariam in Addis Ababa, which is the sole French lycée in Addis Ababa. And then, as you pointed out rightly, I went to a lycée in Berlin, and then did my university studies in France, in Nice, in the south of France, and then in Paris. What brought about this French connection personally? Well, I think you'll have to ask my parents that question, because they decided to put me in a French school. And thereon, of course, once you're in a French school, you go on to basically a track that leads to, like most of people of my generation and succeeding generations, on a track where you go to France, you do universities there. A lot of people go back and pursue careers in Ethiopia, which I did. Some stay here and pursue careers here. Others go to the US. The lycée in Addis, the lycée Gebre Mariam, is really the bedrock of what I would call French culture and French connection with Ethiopia, between France and Ethiopia. It was established many decades ago by our Emperor Haile Selassie, who himself was a Francophone. So for me personally, it is basically, I've been immersed in French culture since I was a young boy. I joined the lycée, I think, at the age of 4. And from there on, I went through the French education system. And then, as you pointed out, I was here in Paris, where I did my master's degree at Panthéon-Sorbonne in international economic law. And then I worked here in La Défense in a consulting firm. And so it's a long connection, especially with French education institutions and French businesses. Yes.
And what has that brought you compared, for instance, with having been educated in the States, for instance, or Britain?
For me, to be quite frank, I think it's a greater connection with European culture, but also a greater connection with Francophone Africa. Because, as you know, a huge chunk of Africa is French-speaking, and I think the sense of Pan-Africanism as well that I personally, and I think many people have, is through also that connection to the whole of Africa. And personally, I've been enriched by French culture, French literature, French arts. And generally, when you have something new or something different, I would say, from what is generally taught in the given environment you're in, it's always a plus. It's definitely a plus, whether it's through personal enrichment or even professionally, because speaking French is an advantage that gives you better, I would say, leverage in the job market. So it has been definitely a plus.
And do you have any plans in terms of not on the professional level, but on the personal level, to develop certain of your interest in French culture here?
Oh, definitely. There is a strong. There was historically a strong cultural connection, but for me now, as I am here, following the visit of President Macron in Addis quite recently, and Prime Minister Abiy as well in France in October, we have taken the relationship to a new level, especially culturally. So France will be engaged in many cultural areas in Ethiopia, including through the Lalibela renovation project, the National Palace renovation project. But here in France as well, my main duty also will be to expose and to promote Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian artists. Ethiopia is now flourishing with young talent that deserve to be known, that deserve to be recognized, whether it's paintings, whether it's culture, whether it's music. And so my role here in France, which is a country that values and treasures cultures from all over the world, is to promote Ethiopian culture in all its forms, in all its beauty, to the French and the global public here in France.
Now, your appointment as ambassador to Paris is not so surprising, perhaps, as you had served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Addis Ababa. But the world of corporate business actually claimed all your talent, or your skills, or your time for a number of years. Now, you joined Ethiopian Airlines in 2010. You first joined them as Director of Corporate Communications and International Affairs. You also worked in several executive management positions, and in October 2017, you became Vice President of Strategic Planning and Alliances. In between, you also, in 2015, you joined ASKI Airlines, based in Togo. Perhaps I should say that Ethiopian Airlines have a stake in ASKI. There's another aspect to this, is that President Macron, as you mentioned, Emmanuel Macron, was in Ethiopia last month when he met President Abiy Ahmed. Agreements were signed touching on military cooperation, for instance, for the training of the Ethiopian armed forces, but also focusing on the Navy and Air Force that Ethiopia wants to either relaunch or develop. But however, there's a number of French business executives accompanied President Macron, and in that context, is the appointment of high-ranking corporate executives such as yourself a sign that Ethiopia means business? So that's from the point of view of Ethiopia. And perhaps can the move, for instance, be linked to the changes that the Quai d'Orsay underwent a few years ago when they asked ambassadors to be more business-minded?
It's a very good parallel that you pointed out there between the move of the Quai d'Orsay to be more business-oriented, and I think the recent appointment of Ethiopian ambassadors all over the world, actually, including to France. There is a clear direction set by the government and by the Prime Minister to have, to the extent possible, people who are competent and know the local context in which they operate. That's one. Two, people who come from a different backgrounds, not necessarily the public sector, but the recent appointment of ambassadors, some came from the private sector, some came from even other sectors not linked to corporate sector in particular. So there is a a will to have a core, a diplomatic core that is competent, but also that understand global dynamics in all its complexity and all its, I would say, diversity, so that people that can understand different sectors. So yes, there is definitely that aspect, encompassing, of course, also business. So yes, I think you hit it on the mill there when you said there is an interest to have people who understand the business world and can better develop relationship with the corporate world here and elsewhere.
And what is your brief, and what basically do you hope also to achieve as ambassador? And another question is that what will be the areas in Franco-Ethiopian relations that you wish to improve or develop?
I think, as I put it earlier, we really have now a optimal situation politically at the highest level following the two visits between President Macron and Prime Minister Abiy to really take the relationship to a strategic level. So the first area is, of course, the areas of where we have common interests globally to act together, whether it's climate change. As you know, France is a huge champion through the Accord de Paris. Ethiopia also follows a green path to development, and we are working very close in this area, both in terms of supporting one another at the global fora, but also in terms of Ethiopia utilizing and harnessing green energy. So that's very important. That's one. Two, of course, the threats at the global level, at the regional level, are threats that concerns us all, France or Ethiopia. So the fight against terrorism is also something we've been working on together, and which we intend to enhance. That's also very important. But generally, at the global level, at multilateral level, pushing the agenda and pushing also multilateralism as a key, I would say, vector for creating understanding and necessary compromise at the international level in order for global governance to have a meaning and to be effective. So that's very important. Secondly, more specifically, on economic and trade issues and investment issues is a huge area of priority for me and for my country in particular. France is one of the most advanced economies. We have, I don't think many people know this, especially here, we have, by comparison to sub-Saharan Africa relations with France, very strong relations in terms of trade. People don't really know this, but Ethiopia is, for example, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to have the biggest trade surplus. I mean, in favor of France, which is not a good thing for Ethiopia, but it's the biggest trade surplus France has with a sub-Saharan African country. It's close to 800 million euros per year. And this is by and large due to the purchase of transportation equipment, by and large Ethiopian Airlines buying the wonderful Airbus aircraft. So in terms of, but having said that, French investment in Ethiopia needs to grow. I think France now ranks fourth among European countries. There are 30 plus companies working, French companies working in Ethiopia, established ones, renowned ones that have solid reputations, such as BGI or Castel or Peugeot. But more are coming, especially, as you said, following the visit of President Macron. And Ethiopia is more than ever ready to receive them, to host them, to facilitate their establishment. We are pursuing a development strategy based, of course, on industrialization through our industrial parks, which have been set up across the country with all the services, amenities of any modern industrial park. And through this, we want to attract French companies engaged in pharmaceuticals, engaged in textile. There are some that are already there, engaged in agro processing and agriculture in general. So France has a lot of know-how that we want to tap into, and we wish to establish, win-win partnership, because it's a big market, Ethiopia. There's a lot of unknown facts about Ethiopia because we're not francophone, as you know, so we're not really known in this part of the world. And part of my job is actually to promote Ethiopia, to create better understanding of Ethiopia, not just the general public, but also the business sector. If the business sector has better understanding of what goes on and what Ethiopia represents, I think they will be more inclined to invest in a market that is huge in size, 110 million people, the second largest in Africa. And it's a young population. It's a growing urban population. It's a fast-growing economy for the last 15 years now, 15 plus years, registering close to 8, 9, 10% GDP growth per annum. So this is really a huge opportunity for French investors to come in at this time, at the right time, in a market that is ready to welcome them. So this is also a very critical area for me, to develop French investment in Ethiopia, to ensure that they invest in Ethiopia and participate in creating a value addition economy in Ethiopia, in transforming goods in Ethiopia and then re-exporting them. That will also help to somehow balance the current trade imbalance we have with France. So that's a second area of priority. The third, of course, we touched upon it earlier, is culture through both state-level cooperation. I mentioned Lalibela, I mentioned the National Palace, but also private initiatives here in France to help Ethiopian arts in general get better traction, get better understanding here, and also expose our history here in France for the public in general. So these are broadly speaking, the areas where I think we should focus on, and that's what I'm here to do, basically.
You've very eloquently actually explained what the aims were. You mentioned earlier that President Abiy had been in France here back in October, and then of course President Macron was in Addis in March. Now, in the wake of that, a number of things were pointed out that there is now a perestroika in Ethiopia thanks to President Abiy. However, with the release of political prisoners, the greater economic regional integration, for instance, greater access or quicker access to the World Trade Organization also. However, the situation appears to remain fragile. There's been a number, particularly when it comes to community or ethnic community strife, that's still to be worked out. There's also heavy bureaucracy, as a number of businesses here or business experts, analysts have pointed out. There's still room for improvement on the part of the Ethiopian administration to actually create a business climate that would help attract businesses, foreign direct investment to the country. There's also, you're talking the young people. There's about 2 or 2.5 million each year who actually join enter the work the market. What are your views on and how quickly can things improve to make an impact, not only in terms of investment, of course, first, but also in terms of creating jobs, creating opportunities, whether it's in education or in just the job market?
Yeah, thank you. These are very, very important questions you raised about the current developments in the country. Yes, since now over a year, since Prime Minister Abiy assumed power, Ethiopia is now really on a transformation path. This transformation path, as you rightly pointed out, led to the complete liberalization of the political space, the opening up of political space, the decriminalizing of political activity and political opposition, which has meant that all political actors or political parties involved in Ethiopia that were abroad have all come into Ethiopia and now participating in the political space. This is unprecedented for a country like Ethiopia. It's an old country, Ethiopia, and we have a long state tradition. Perhaps the oldest state in the world, with state continuity dating back to the antiquities. But democracy is new. I can confidently say that democracy, the culture of democracy, will take time to take root. definitely. But the Prime Minister is committed, the government is committed, and the people of Ethiopia are committed. So that transition, as you said, is taking place right now. And generally speaking, the trajectory is very, very positive, very positive. You mentioned the regional dynamics, the regional dimension with the peace with Eritrea, and the will of the government is, of course, to have a space within our region whereby our peoples can live in peace, but also have integration, just like you have it here in Europe. It's only by creating scale that we will be able to overcome our development challenges. You mentioned the challenges we have in terms of, but these in terms of the ethnic strife. This, I would say, is the result and the consequence of the many decades of ethnic divisions within Ethiopia. It will take time to root them out, but I don't think there is any doubt about the determination to root them out. It will take education, it will take the deepening of the culture of peace and the involvement of all society to ensure that we are all at peace and in democracy and with rule of law. Those are the critical three aspects that we're trying to root in the country currently. Yes, bureaucracy is a challenge. It's a challenge in many countries, as you know, and we always can do better to improve business climate and the ease of doing business. It is also understanding our challenge that we have embarked upon with the initiative, through the initiative of Prime Minister Abiy, to greatly enhance, greatly improve the business climate in Ethiopia. He is driving it personally. It, of course, touches many sectors. It's a cross-sectoral initiative, and we intend to be among the most competitive African countries in terms of ease of doing business. You mentioned also about the young people in Ethiopia, the more than 2 million people you said that come on the workforce or in the workforce every year. Yes, it's a challenge and an opportunity. It's an opportunity if we utilize them, if we give them the resources, the skills they need to participate in the development of the country. That is what this government is determined to do and is doing. That is what the opening up of the economic space is all about. Creating the better business environment so that private entrepreneurship can flourish and develop. But it's a real opportunity. I know here in Europe the challenges of an aging population and what that means in terms of economic development. For us, we have to use this opportunity to deploy our workforce, our young workforce, to develop our economy, and that's what government policy is geared towards to. Lastly, I just want to mention in terms of, because it's a point of that's in the news now. As you know, between the 1st and I think the 3rd of May, UNESCO's World Press Freedom Day will be organized in Ethiopia for the first time. That's a huge recognition, and it's also an honor for us, for a country like Ethiopia, which for so long had been, blacklisted as being an oppressor of freedom of speech, and the recognition given to Ethiopia to host this as an encouragement of the very positive steps that have been taken. So these are all things that are moving the country in the right direction, and the dynamic is very positive, and we are all encouraged by it, and we hope that RFI also will be an active participant during the World Press Freedom Day many events.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Henok Teferra Shawl, for joining us today and so comprehensively putting forward your aims, your views, your hopes as ambassador here in France. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.